Okay, well, welcome everybody who has joined us. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. My name's Lydia Harrison MW. I am Head of Education and Events at WSET School London, and it's my pleasure to welcome Emma Symington MW this evening to host another of our wonderful Australian webinars. So this evening's topic is Discover Australia Alternative Varieties. But just to note that we have run several other webinars with Emma and Wine Australia. So if you want to check those out, all the recordings are up on the WSET School London YouTube channel, and this one after tonight will also be posted there. So if you missed any of it or you would like to watch it back, you will be able to find it there. As we said, please use the chat to say hello. There's also a separate tab that you can see for Q&A. So please put any questions that you have for Emma into the Q&A box, and I will keep an eye on those during the webinar this evening and put any questions to her at the end. And so I think that's all of the housekeeping. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Emma. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Lydia, and hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on Australia's alternative grape varieties. As Lydia said, my name's Emma Symington. I'm a Master of Wine and I work for Wine Australia, so Wine Australia being the generic body for Australian wine. And I have run a few of these sessions now for WSET School London, looking at various different grape varieties across Australia and generally the sort of key best known varieties. So it's really great to be back today talking about alternative grape varieties, because there are a huge number of different grape varieties grown in Australia, and it's far beyond, I suppose, the mainstream being Shiraz, Chardonnay and Cabernet and so on. But just quickly before we head into the webinar itself, I just really wanted to point out our education website, which is australianwinediscovered.com, as you can see on the screen in front of you. So we've set this up over the last few years, and it now consists of 28 different modules. So that covers all the key grape varieties in Australia. There's one specifically also on alternative varieties. All the key regions are in there, and there's broader topics as well, like there's one on sparkling wine and one on old vines and so on. And really, if you are studying for your WSET exams or any other wine exams, this is an absolute goldmine. It is your sort of one-stop shop for everything you can want to know about Australian wine. Each of the modules has PowerPoint presentations you can go in and download and use. There's study guides, there's video content, there's maps, there's quizzes. It's all there and it's all to use and totally free. You do have to register to use the site, but once you've done that, you can go in and download anything and use it as you see fit. So just a great website to be aware of for your own education. As I said, today, we're looking specifically at alternative grape varieties in Australia. So this is what we're going to cover within the next 45 minutes or so. We'll look quickly at the history of alternative varieties, sort of, when they started in Australia and where they are today. We'll look at the process of introducing new grape varieties into Australia and how easy or hard that is. We'll discuss some of the reasons behind the rise of alternative grape varieties and why this is sort of a real emerging phenomenon at the minute, and then we'll discuss some of the key regions in Australia where alternative varieties are really kind of leading the charge, and there's lots of people planting different varieties. So that's what we've got ahead of us. So quickly, before we head into the history, what is an alternative variety? Well, it's really quite simple. It's anything that's not one of the mainstream varieties. And really, there's probably only about 10 or 15 what you'd call mainstream varieties in Australia. So that, of course, being things like Shiraz, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Grenache, and so on. But you start counting through those varieties, and quite quickly you sort of you finish your list of mainstream varieties, and everything after that is classed as an alternative variety, also called sometimes emerging grape varieties, or perhaps also climate appropriate varieties is a term I do hear as well to describe these sort of grape varieties. But there's actually over 150 different grape varieties grown in Australia today. So, if I said there's about 15 kind of mainstream varieties, you can see there's a huge number of alternative varieties grown in Australia. That being said, they're still quite small in terms of total plantings. Probably only about 4 to 5% of total plantings within Australia are alternative varieties. But I think they're really a lot of conversation, a lot of excitement, and of course, a lot of experimentation happening around alternative varieties. So where did this story start? Well, actually, it really started really at the beginning of the Australian wine story. So Australia is, of course, a New World wine country, and it is not home to any indigenous wine grape varieties. So therefore, wine grapes or cuttings of vines had to be brought out to Australia in order to start, growing, planting vineyards and making wine. And really, alternative varieties sort of started arriving in Australia, right back in those early days. So some of you who've been to some of these webinars I've done before might have heard me talk about a man called James Busby. So he is a man that was really considered to be the forefather of the Australian wine industry. He was Scottish, he was a horticulturalist and moved over to Australia in the 1820s. And when he was there, he became interested in viticulture and then got a job with the government of the time, the Australian government of the time, and they sent him back to Europe in 1831. And he spent 6 months touring wine regions of France and Spain. And he was tasked with taking cuttings of different grape varieties in order to bring these back to Australia. And he ended up with cuttings of hundreds of different grape varieties. And these then came back to Australia with him. So any number of alternative grape varieties actually came back with him at the time. So that was quite a big, important sort of early days, I suppose, importation of alternative varieties into Australia. And as you can see from the timeline in front of you, so in 1868, it's quite a long time ago, in Victoria, in a region called the Grampians, a man called Henry Best planted Dolcetto. And that is still actually in production today, that vineyard that he planted. And these are considered to be the oldest ungrafted vines of Dolcetto anywhere in the world. So just again, underlining that this alternative variety story is not really a new thing. It's something that's been there really since the very early days of Australian viticulture. But through the early part of the 20th century, the story really predominantly was about French grape varieties in Australia and also about fortified wines. So at the time, there was also a number of Portuguese grape varieties grown there specifically for fortified wines. But it really wasn't until the late 20th century that things really began to kick off in terms of people becoming a bit more interested in alternative varieties and planting different things in larger quantities. So just a few things to pull out on here. In 1980, Yalumba planted Viognier, and at the time they were the first people to plant Viognier in Australia. But of course, now that as a grape variety has really taken off. There's quite a lot of plantings of Viognier in Australia, and it's really become a mainstream grape variety. So that is one of the very few grapes that I suppose originally were classed as an alternative variety, and now Viognier is really considered as a mainstream variety. So it's kind of jumped that hurdle into the mainstream. In 1985, Coriol planted a Sangiovese vineyard in McLaren Vale. Now, Sangiovese as a variety actually came into Australia in the 1960s. So it had been in Australia in experimental plantings for a while before then, but they were the first people to really, I suppose, put it on the map in terms of Australia and planting it and, making some amazing wine from it. And then as we head into the early 2000s, this is when really things began to kick off in terms of alternative varieties. And we're seeing more and more different varieties sort of coming to the fore, people experimenting with different varieties, perhaps top grafting vineyards over to different alternative varieties. And this has happened for a number of different reasons, which I'll talk through a bit in a minute, but I think also partly has changed because of consumer demand, particularly domestically in Australia, but also globally. I think consumers really are, looking to experiment, looking to try new things. And this is where, these alternative grape varieties are, finding a happy home with a lot of these consumers. So as I said, there are over 150 different grape varieties in Australia, which is quite a lot for a New World country. But it probably makes sense, again, when you consider how big Australia is, because yes, Australia is one country, but it is a continent-sized country. As you can see from this map here, it is bigger than Europe. So it should be perhaps no surprise that in a country that's bigger than Europe, there are a number of different, climatic zones, climatic regions, different soil types, different topographies, different places to suit a lot of different grape varieties, as of course we see across Europe. So what's the process of introducing a new grape variety into Australia? Well, the reality is it's not easy and it takes a long time. If any of you have visited Australia, gone there as a tourist, you'll probably be aware of how strict the quarantine laws are in terms of bringing things into Australia. I certainly remember going over there and my shoes that I was wearing were taken off me and had to be scrubbed because there was a bit of soil on the bottom of the shoe. And of course, you can't take any plant material in, you can't take any fruit or veg or anything like that into Australia. They're very, very strict in terms of keeping their borders safe, making sure no plant material comes in because they don't want any unknown diseases, pests or viruses or so on coming into the country. So similarly, when you want to bring in cuttings of new grape varieties into Australia, you have to go through this process of quarantine. And it is something that takes a really long time. Now, I can give you an example of a winery that wanted to bring in a new variety into Australia and how long that took. So some of you may have heard of the Jim Barry winery, the Barry family. They're based in the Clare Valley. And back in 2006, Peter Barry, who was the winemaker at the time, he was on holiday in Santorini and he tasted a Certico for the first time, the grape variety, and quickly fell in love with it. And he saw a lot of similarities in terms of the acidity and the flavor profile to how he viewed Clare Valley Riesling. So he decided that he wanted to grow some Assyrtiko in their vineyards in the Clare Valley. But at the time, there wasn't any Assyrtiko available at all in Australia. No one had ever brought it in. So he decided to go through this process of bringing in cuttings of Assyrtiko into Australia. So first of all, he had to find a winery in Santorini who would be happy to give him some cuttings. And back in 2008, he got cuttings of 12 dormant cuttings of Assyrtiko, which came over from Santorini into Australia. At that point, they entered 2 years of quarantine. And this was quarantine to obviously grow those cuttings on, check that there weren't any diseases or any virals, any viruses or any other issues with these cuttings. At the end of that 2 years, he ended up with 2 cuttings. So he started with 12, he ended up with 2. So obviously the other cuttings were discarded along the way for some different sorts of reasons, possibly some viral issues, I'm not entirely sure. So those cuttings were released to him in 2010 and they were propagated on. So that took another couple of years to propagate those cuttings on and then take more cuttings. And he was eventually able to plant his vines in 2012. And the first release of the wine was in 2016. So from tasting the wine originally in Santorini or tasting the grape variety in 2006 and deciding this is the process that he wanted to go through, it took 10 years before actually being able to, make some wine from this grape variety in Clare Valley. So it is a very, very long process and you really have to be invested and excited, I suppose, about bringing this variety into Australia. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Because when you're bringing in a new variety to a new country, to perhaps a new climate, to perhaps new soil types, there's any number of then additional questions that you sort of have to answer along the way. How suitable is the region's climate and soils actually to that grape variety? So for example, with Assyrtiko, obviously the climate in Clare is very different to that of Santorini. Clare Valley is an inland continental climate. Santorini is obviously an island. So very, very different. And until you've got those vines in the ground and are making the wine, you don't actually know what you're going to end up with. But I think the interesting thing also with planting these new varieties is what you're going to do in terms of winemaking. Do you stay with the same traditions that perhaps that variety is made in Europe, or do you try something new? There's all these questions that, you know, the viticulturists and the winemakers have to answer or continue to ask themselves as they're going through this process. So why are alternative varieties thriving in Australia? So I mentioned earlier about this sort of changing consumer demand, particularly domestically in Australia, about people wanting to try new things. So I think that is definitely, you know, leading the charge a bit and helping push winemakers and lead this experimental change. But I think there's two other key reasons as well. The first really being innovation and experimentation, and the second being climate change. So looking at innovation, I think that for me, one of the things I love about the Australians and the winemakers there is they're always keen to try something new, push the envelope, perhaps try new things, but not be afraid of getting it wrong or I don't want to use the word failing, but it not going the way they expected to, because that's how you learn and that's how you then grow for next time. So this, you know, trying new things, being progressive, this creativity and this freedom. And I think that's part, again, of the reason why alternative varieties are thriving and changing things in Australia is because of the lack of restrictions. So of course, when we look at Europe and look at wine regions, not only are the regions defined and delimited in terms of their boundaries, but there's often quite a lot of laws around perhaps viticulture, perhaps in terms of yields or picking dates. There also can be laws in terms of winemaking, perhaps, you know, what barrels you can use or how long wine has to be aged before it's released. You know, all sorts of different things can restrict winemakers. And of course, what can be planted or not planted in a region. When it comes to Australia, there is much more freedom for the winemaker. Now, with the regions in Australia, it's exactly the same as regions in Europe in terms of the boundaries. So if a wine is labelled as, say, McLaren Vale, 85% of the grapes in there have to come from McLaren Vale. So that's exactly the same as regions elsewhere around the world. But beyond that, it's entirely up to the winemaker and the viticulturist what they do. There's no laws around what they can or can't plant. There's no laws around winemaking. So this sort of ability to innovate and experiment really is helping push the curve, move the curve in terms of alternative grape varieties. But then I think something else that's really front of mind, really, well, should be front of mind for all of us, shouldn't it, is, you know, the global climate crisis and what's happening with climate change. And this, of course, is true for really whatever industry you're working in around the world. But I think viticulture is one of those kind of canaries in the coal mine. And it's a place where people are really seeing things happen quickly at the coalface, as it were. So I think, you know, this changing climate is really front of mind and is one of the reasons why people are perhaps moving towards some of these alternative grape varieties. So in Australia's regions, you know, the prediction is for many of them to become warmer and drier over time. And so because of that, a lot of people are moving perhaps away from some of the traditional varieties that were originally planted in some of these regions across to some of the Mediterranean varieties. And the reasons behind this is rather twofold. Firstly, often Mediterranean varieties, so I'm talking things like Vermentino and Fiano in terms of white grapes, instead of perhaps Chardonnay. These are grape varieties that really keep their acidity. So they hold their acidity as they ripen, which is obviously great when it comes from making wine. You don't have to do any interventions in the winery. It keeps that freshness in the grapes. But also these grape varieties often are ones that require less water input, so they don't need as much water through the growing season. So when it comes to looking at working sustainably, and obviously being aware of climate change, in drying climates, it's really important that perhaps you consider how much water you're using in the vineyard. And these grape varieties that require less water can be a huge positive, a huge benefit over some of the more traditional grape varieties. So again, this is very much front of mind for many winemakers and really helping move things perhaps away from some of the more traditional varieties that were planted in some regions. Okay, so that all being said, we'll look at some of the notable regions for alternative grape varieties in Australia. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that actually probably most of the regions in Australia are growing at least one alternative grape variety. So it's not like there's only a few which are growing these varieties, but I think there are a few that are particularly well known, either for certain styles of varieties or alternative varieties in general. So we will kick off by talking about the King Valley. So the King Valley, as you can see, is in Victoria. It's northeast of Melbourne. It's about a 3-hour drive inland up to the King Valley. Now I've included these maps as we go through for two reasons really. So this is a map that we've produced using remote satellite imaging software. So you obviously can see the regional boundary, you can obviously pick out the topography, and then these dark green areas you can see on the map are where the vineyards are. So it just gives you a nice idea about how widely or not widely planted these regions are. So the King Valley, as you can see, doesn't have a huge amount of vineyard area. It's a little over 1,000 hectares. And there is a big difference in topography, as you can see across the region. So in the south, we're heading up into the kind of foothills of the Great Dividing Range. So there's some serious elevation here. The highest vineyards down in the south of the region are sitting well over 800 meters in terms of elevation. So cool climate because of that. And as you head north, you're actually heading downstream and heading much lower in terms of elevation, so down to about 250 meters. So the King Valley, therefore, has this quite big variation in terms of elevation across the region, and also, therefore, in terms of climate. So much warmer towards the north, much cooler towards the south. And this means it's a region that can grow quite a lot of different grape varieties, depending on what climate profile they prefer. And there's actually over 40 different grape varieties grown in the King Valley. Now, the King Valley probably isn't a region you may well have heard of. It's, as I said earlier, quite a small region in terms of production, but it really is at the forefront of alternative grape varieties, and particularly for Italian grape varieties. As a region, it was originally kind of started actually as a tobacco growing region. It was settled by Italian immigrants after World War II, and most of them, started planting tobacco. But when the market really fell out of the tobacco industry, back in the 1970s and 1980s, people started moving away from tobacco, and viticulture is one thing many of them moved across to. And obviously with that Italian heritage, you can see why there's a lot of Italian grape varieties planted in the King Valley. So I've just included a snapshot of different labels, different wineries, and different grape varieties that you can see coming out of the King Valley, just to give you an idea of what is planted there. And on the left-hand side, you can see Prosecco. Now, Prosecco is really probably the key grape variety that King Valley is really making itself known for domestically within Australia. And I imagine a lot of you are probably sitting at home now going, Prosecco is not a grape variety, it's a region in Italy. And yes, you're not wrong. But before 2009, Prosecco was a grape variety. For any of you old enough like me to remember that, there was a time in 2009 when I remember the Italians essentially changed the law and changed Prosecco from being a grape variety, instead called it a synonym, which is glera, and changed it to being a region, and told people elsewhere in the world they weren't allowed to call it Prosecco anymore. But in the King Valley, the story goes back before that, because the first plantings of Prosecco as a grape variety were in 1999. So this predated this change in Italian law by 10 years. And so in Australia currently, grape growers can still plant it as, call it Prosecco. It's labelled as Prosecco. They obviously can't export it to the EU and call it Prosecco. So you do see some of these wines over here, but they're not ever labelled as Prosecco. But certainly if you go down to Australia, there's a Prosecco road in the King Valley. You know, you can go on and visit all these wineries and taste all these different Proseccos or Australian Prosecco. So it's kind of special to the King Valley. But it's certainly something that is causing waves at the minute, because you may well be aware of there's an Australian EU free trade agreement going through, and this is one of the sticking points at the minute is Prosecco. So we will see where that gets to. Heading across to the second bottle, you can see we've got a Garganega. Oh, it's actually a Garganega Gewürztraminer blend. So again, just underlining this Italian heritage there. Nebbiolo, a great variety that is grown in a number of different regions now, actually in Australia. King Valley being one of the key ones, but I've also seen it from Yarra Valley, Adelaide Hills, Mornington Peninsula. It's a great variety that really does well in regions where they've got cool nights. So here inland in King Valley, they do have that high diurnal variation, and it does suit Nebbiolo very well. I think it's a great variety that a lot of winemakers and viticulturalists sort of like to challenge themselves with. It's not an easy variety to grow. It's not an easy variety to make well. But when it is made well, you know, there are some beautiful Nebbiolos coming out of Australia now. And then you can see on the far right, a Sangiovese, and that is really an alternative variety that is growing in plantings in a number of different regions. It seems to be very well suited to a lot of different regions within Australia, particularly those with more Mediterranean climates. So as you can see overall here for King Valley, it really is that Italian grape variety story. Okay, and then for our other, I think, 3 regions, I'm just going to briefly talk about. So we're heading up to South Australia. So the first one being McLaren Vale. So as you can see here, McLaren Vale is just south of Adelaide on the coast. If I move on here, you can see a bit better. It sits really between the coast and then heading up into the foothills of the Adelaide Hills. It is a beautiful region if you ever get the chance to visit, because you've got these lovely golden sand beaches, blue sea, and then just surrounded by the hills across to the east. It's a lovely place. It's a very historic wine region, actually. It was the first region planted in South Australia. That was back in 1838. And it really is still dominated by, I suppose, the traditional varieties, particularly Shiraz and Grenache. But there are a number of so-called younger winemakers, and people experimenting with a number of different grape varieties. So it is a region that's kind of leading the charge with alternative varieties. And again, we've got a sort of snapshot of some of the different things you can find in McLaren Vale made from alternative varieties. So across on the left there, you have Arinto. So Arinto, if you don't know it, is a Portuguese grape variety, particularly well suited to McLaren Vale, suits that Mediterranean climate, but it's a white grape variety that, as I said earlier, really holds its acidity very nicely. And then we have Fiano, so another Italian grape variety, again has that ability to hold its acidity, so seems to be suited very well to McLaren Vale. You know, it's from Campania in southern Italy, so that absolute Mediterranean climate, which suits exactly what you get in McLaren Vale. Mencia. So Mencia, you may well have heard of. It's a Spanish grape variety from northwest Spain, best known perhaps from Bierzo. There's not very much Mencia at all at the minute in Australia, but I think it's one that a number of people are becoming more and more interested in, partly because it's something consumers are becoming more and more interested in, but it again seems to be finding quite a happy home in McLaren Vale. And then Touriga Nacional. So Touriga is one of those grape varieties that has actually been in Australia quite a long time. I think I mentioned earlier, back in the early 1900s, there was quite a lot of fortified produced and drunk in Australia. And a lot of the port grape varieties were planted at the time for fortified production within Australia. So Touriga would have been there from the early days, albeit plantings have grown much more recently. It's a grape variety that's very heat resistant. So again, has this, I suppose when people are thinking about climate change and changing climates, it's a variety that is kind of front of mind. So the Adelaide Hills, again, near, well, not too far from McLaren Vale, and the clue is in the name here, hills just outside Adelaide. Again, a historic region in terms of early plantings, but planting ceased in Adelaide, in Adelaide Hills by the early 1920s. And it's only really since the 1970s onwards that viticulture has restarted there. And it was restarted because of things like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But again, it's a region where there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of younger winemakers trying new things. And it's a region where alternative grape varieties really seem to be thriving. So as you can see from this map, it's actually a really big region. And a bit like King Valley, it has a number of different sort of climatic areas within it. The two official subregions you can see on the map there that are circled in orange. So Piccadilly Valley and Lenswood. So those are the highest parts of the Adelaide Hills, sort of 650 or odd meters in terms of altitude. So very cool climate. That's where you get a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir from, and also a lot of sparkling wine made. But as you head north and as you head east and also as you head south, the altitude kind of falls off. You're heading down to about 300 meters in terms of altitude. So those sites are going to be very much warmer. So again, a bit like the King Valley, this gives, as a region, the ability to have quite a number of different grape varieties suited to different parts of the region. And interestingly, one of the key grape varieties or alternative grape varieties that Adelaide Hills seems to be very well suited to is Grüne Veltliner. So Grüne Veltliner, of course, being Austria's most important white grape variety, but is now really found a happy home down under in the Adelaide Hills. That's partly because of the climate of the Adelaide Hills. As I said, it is relatively high in altitude. And this gives the region a very large diurnal variation. So it could be, warm to hot in the daytime in the summer, but at night it gets very, very cold. So this keeps that lovely acidity in the grapes. And that's very similar to, what you see in Austria, where the grape comes from. It's also Adelaide Hills, or particularly the parts of the Adelaide Hills where Grüne is best planted, is on very free draining blue-red slate soils. And again, that seems to be a soil type that's particularly well suited to Grüne Veltliner. So it's a grape variety that's really, really thriving within the Adelaide Hills and has been there, I think, for about 15 odd years now. Harndorf Hill, the winery that you can see here, these were the people that originally brought in the cuttings of Adelaide Hills, of Grüne Veltliner. So that was back in 2006. And they've really helped develop a group of wineries, a group of growers within the Adelaide Hills to promote Grüne Veltliner. So they've, shared those cuttings and shared those clones with other people within the Adelaide Hills. And there's about 30 different producers now of Grüne Veltliner in the Adelaide Hills. And Harndorf Hill themselves also grow other Austrian grape varieties. So they have Blaufränkisch, they have Zweigelt, they have Saint Laurent, all sorts of different things. So it's kind of a little personal journey for them with those Austrian varieties. But as you can see from the picture in front of you, it's not just about Austrian alternative varieties that are sort of thriving in the Adelaide Hills. There's also, again, a lot of Italian grape varieties. You can see here Arnese and Barbera. So from, Piedmont in Italy. And there's also a number of Spanish and Portuguese grape varieties there too. I've picked out Tempranillo here. Tempranillo, again, is a grape variety that really seems to be thriving in a number of different wine regions within Australia. And then the final region that I think is quite interesting to talk about is the Riverland. So this is sticking in South Australia, as you can see, but heading much further inland. And it may be a region you've heard about before, because it's really the powerhouse of the South Australian wine industry. It is one of the largest regions in terms of production in Australia. There's just over 22,000 hectares of vineyard there. So a huge amount of vineyard area. And it's really for a long time is somewhere that I suppose really people thought about for bulk wine, you know, for branded wine, lots of Chardonnay, Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, and so on. But it's a region that more recently is kind of changing things around quite significantly. And again, there's a group of younger producers who are, I suppose, for the reasons that I talked about earlier in terms of innovation, experimentation, but also particularly in terms of climate change, who are moving towards alternative varieties and really changing things in terms of Riverland and changing, I think, growers' perspective across the region in total. So again, I've picked out a few different grape varieties that, you know, we see from Riverland. So Riverland, as I said, is an inland region. It's a hot region. It's really reliant on irrigation water from the River Murray. And again, you know, in a changing climate, who knows what will happen in terms of the amount of irrigation water that's going to be available. So moving across to some of these grape varieties that require less irrigation water. And remembering as well that irrigation water isn't free, growers have to pay for it. And so, you know, working with grape varieties where you need less water input is of benefit for many reasons. So Vermentino, I've picked out here as a great variety in a lot of these regions, you know, again, for similar reasons why it thrives in Italy and France. You know, it keeps its acidity. It's a lovely, fresh, vibrant white grape variety. And across the reds that you can see there, Nero d'Avola, Montepulciano, Tinta Barocca. So Tinta Barocca, again, one of those Portuguese varieties that has probably been in the country in Australia for quite a long time because it would have been used for fortified wine, you know, back in the early 20th century. But now is kind of having a new lease of life. People are using it to make table wine instead. But really the interesting one when it comes to Riverland is your second for the left there, Zabibbo. So Zabibbo is the Sicilian name for Muscat of Alexandria. And it's a name that grape variety is really well known for in Australia. And Riverland itself has a huge number, well, relatively huge number of old vine Zabibbo vineyards. So this particular wine, this is from a winery called Brash Higgins, that's from 75-year-old vines. So again, just underlining the fact that, yes, these are alternative varieties, but some of them have been in the ground for quite a long time. And these old vine Zabibbo vineyards for a long time were not well respected. Growers were not paid very much money for, they were probably blended away. But now this younger generation of winemakers are really prizing these vineyards, which is great. You know, they're paying the growers a huge amount more money for those grapes and giving this variety, these grapes, a new lease of life. So Riverland Zabibbo is certainly something to be aware of. Keep an eye out for, you know, on your local bottle shop shelves, because there's some really, really delicious wines being made from that particular grape variety. And I should say, I've chosen all of these bottle shots. That's what I'm based in the UK. And I think pretty much all of these wines are available here. So I know I started off by saying that, you know, some of this, the reason for this increase in interest in alternative varieties is a changing demand domestically within Australia. But I think that's something we're seeing on a more macro scale globally. You know, there is this increase in interest in indigenous grape varieties or alternative varieties when you're looking at the New World. So you absolutely can, you know, buy these wines in a number of different export markets. So please do keep an eye out for them. You know, there's far more to Australia than just Shiraz and Chardonnay, and far, far more exciting wines out there too. I think that was really everything I wanted to cover. So were there any questions?
We have not received any questions so far. I think everyone was so engrossed in your in your wonderful presentation. Nothing has come through at the minute, but we'll give them a last chance. If you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A and I will put them to Emma shortly. So we shall see. Obviously an area people don't know maybe quite so much about.
It is an interesting area. And certainly it's an area, if you start exploring in terms of buying more wine, you just end up buying more and more, because you know, there's a lot to explore, a lot of interest out there and a lot of these great varieties.
Oh, I just saw one question in the chat. Hold on, let me scroll back. A question from Liliana asking, how popular is biodynamic winemaking?
Good question. I don't have any specific stats across Australia. I can tell you in terms of, I mentioned McLaren Vale earlier, and I just know this because it's a stat that's in my head. Within McLaren Vale, and that it's quite a big wine region in terms of production, but then really known as Australia's greenest wine region, because well over a third of all vineyard in the region is certified as either organic or biodynamic. And I think that's a region that's absolutely at the forefront in terms of working sustainably. But this is something we're seeing in many, many different wine regions across Australia. Yeah. Oh, I think you're on mute, I'm afraid, Lydia.
Oh, sorry. Out of practice. So yeah, a few questions have come through now. So one from Roberto asking, what about alternative varieties in Tasmania due to its cool climate?
Good question. I haven't seen a huge amount of alternative varieties in this market from Tasmania, but that's not to say they're not there, because the interesting thing with Tasmania as a region is that so little of it is exported. I think the stat is something like 40% of everything made in Tasmania is drunk on Tasmania. Another 55% is drunk in the rest of Australia, and that only leaves about 5% for export. So it might well just be that, you know, alternative varieties are there and they're just not, they don't find themselves into the export markets.
Fair enough. Tim has mentioned that you focused on southeastern Australia with the regions that you picked out. Are there any alternative varieties? Are alternative varieties a thing in the southwest?
So across in Western Australia, yeah. So the region, there's a region called Geograph, which is sort of just north of Margaret River. And that's a region that seems to be at kind of the forefront of alternative varieties in Western Australia. That's again more this Mediterranean climate, so you get a lot of those Mediterranean varieties planted in Geograph, and there's certainly a bit in places like Margaret River and so on as well. I think, as I said at the beginning, most regions within Australia will probably have small plantings of a few different alternative varieties.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, I think that's what struck me when I visited, is that there's people always experimenting, and that kind of links to the next question, which was referencing the fact that you talked about it taking 10 years from them to get a Certico into Australia, and sort of from the grafts to the bottle, essentially. Are there any other examples or varieties that have been planted in the last few years that we can expect to see soon? So anything that you're aware of in the pipeline?
Good question. I think the interesting one that I know is coming down the line is Nero Mascalese. So there's a family-owned company called the Chalmers family. So they're based in Mildura, and they're particularly well known for working with Italian grape varieties that they've brought in. I think 80 different Italian varieties just themselves. And they've been working for a long time trying to bring Nero Mascalese, from Sicily into Australia, but they had a real problem for a long time getting clean genetic material. But I believe they've just been able to get their first cuttings out of quarantine. So I think that's something we're going to see, because there's a lot of interest from winemakers in Australia for Nero particularly. So that's something to keep an eye out for.
There you go, you heard it here first. Sue asked, are there any real surprises for you here, Emma? Any varieties you hadn't expected that are thriving in Australia?
Oh, great question. No, I don't think so. In that, I think when it comes to Australia, as I said earlier, because it is such a big country and there are so many different, climatic variations between the regions, there really should be a happy home somewhere within that for pretty much every grape variety you could think of. So I think, there really should be a home down under for any variety. And I think when they thrive then, or, when there's more and more plantings, it's perhaps less about the ability for it to grow and more about what consumers are demanding or what winemakers want to experiment with as well, rather than, any, I suppose, intrinsic correlation with the soil or the climate.
Brilliant, thank you. A few more. All the questions are coming in thick and fast now. So slightly, obviously this focus tonight was on alternative varieties, but a question relating to the sort of more existing or traditional varieties in Australia, but asking whether some of those would be being pulled up due to climate change.
I don't think so, not in the short term for sure. And I don't think any of them would necessarily be pulled up, in that I think many people will be top grafting over to other alternative varieties or otherwise instead. So, for the foreseeable future, I don't see things changing really. It's just going to be kind of small changes here and there where people perhaps if a vineyard's getting old or isn't performing very well, then people are going to move across to something else instead. But there's not going to be a sort of wholesale change overnight for sure.
Thank you. And then we've had a couple of questions, one from Ben, one from Brian, asking where we can find these wines in the UK. So are there any specialist importers or retailers that you could recommend selling some of these more unusual varieties?
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be things you're finding in, your local Sainsbury's for sure. They're things that you go and chat to your local independent wine merchants. They're the people who are best placed to be able to track these sort of wines down for you. And there's, a number of importers are dealing with, different wineries from across Australia and bringing in different alternative varieties. So as I said, pretty much all of the images I showed you earlier, you can get in different places in the UK. Obviously, a lot of it's coming in quite small quantity. And so, yeah, I think talking to your local retailer is probably the best place to start.
Excellent, thank you. And then you obviously talked about the fact that it was sort of some of the younger generation winemakers in Australia that were sort of developing these alternative varieties. But Clorinda has asked about the sort of target audience. So she's asking, shall we assume that Australia is targeting millennials with these innovations? Do you think that's a fair comment, or do you think?
Great question. Yes and no. It's probably the easiest answer, in that I think globally for the wine industry, wine consumption is in decline globally. So, always bringing in new consumers is kind of front of mind for anyone wanting to sell wine. And certainly when it comes to a lot of these alternative varieties domestically in Australia, a lot of them are sold through wine bars, and so often are aimed at a younger clientele. That being said, I think it doesn't stop there. They're for everyone, and certainly if things like Nebbiolo, for example, that as a variety is a variety that is well respected and well loved by people of many different generations, and so there's no reason why people who love Nebbiolo or love Barolo and so on wouldn't want to try an Australian version.
I agree. It can appeal to all wine enthusiasts, and as someone who I'm never quite sure if I scrape into a millennial or not, I'm I'm in favour of it appealing to lots of people.
Quite.
Okay, I think one more question to finish on, which again could be a little tricky, but Richard is asking, if you pitch, say, the Tempranillo you showed against its equivalent price value point from Spain, would it have a more fruit forward, accessible Australian style in a tasting? So always tricky to generalize, but could you perhaps?
It is, yeah, absolutely. It is always tricky to generalize. I would say when it comes to Australia, because of the latitude it sits, on the globe, There's always a sunlight intensity you get in Australia, regardless of whatever climate, you know, even in the very coldest parts of Australia, you always have this sunlight intensity. And what that means is you always get this kind of core of fruit ripeness in grapes and in wine. And so I think you can always expect that lovely, fresh, vibrant fruit character coming through. And when it comes to Tempranillo, perhaps you will see more of that from an Aussie version versus a Spanish version. You're certainly a lot less likely to see a huge amount of oak in the Aussie version, because people are moving away from, you know, over oaking their wines, and so allowing that fruit to shine through. So I think that would probably be one of the key differences as well.
Brilliant. And maybe perhaps fair to mention that I think, especially at the lower end of the price point, some of these wines are probably, just because of the nature of them being so small scale, and in some of these sort of lesser known regions or lesser known varieties in small production, that they're probably not produced at some of the sort of on par with some of the more accessible price Spanish wines.
That's exactly true, and certainly can be a reason why sometimes these can be a hard sell in the export markets, particularly the European export markets, because, you know, when you're getting the same grape variety planted from its, I suppose, traditional region in Europe and planted and costing a lot less, it can be a tricky sell, which is why a lot of these alternative varieties are particularly performing well domestically, because they don't have that comparison. That being said, you know, they're not expensive because they're unusual. They're expensive because, or not expensive, they cost a little bit more than perhaps your average supermarket bottle of wine, because, you know, they're made in small production. There's not a lot of them. You know, these aren't huge production wines, so, you know, there is a cost implication there, I suppose. But that being said, I think the quality sort of stands up to that cost, you know.
Definitely, yeah. From the ones that I've been fortunate enough to taste, yeah, they're always really pleasantly surprising. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening and for our whistle stop tour around Australia and the alternative varieties. And thank you to everybody for attending this evening. We had a really good turnout. So thank you for joining in, listening, and for the interesting questions at the end. And as I mentioned, the recording will be live hopefully tomorrow on our YouTube channel.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, Lydia. Bye.